overhauling the motor, transitioning the Australian Supercar Championship towards sustainable engine options. Firstly, I wanted to take a brief look at the history of Australian Touring Car Championship, which was also called later on the V8 Supercars and now just Supercars. In 1969, it was the first year that a formal multiple round based championship began for the Australian Touring Car Championships. The cars used were largely road available production models, very unaltered from what was available on the road. Between 1970 and 1980, really birthed the Ford versus Holden rivalry. Once again, these were largely unchanged local built production cars. They were mostly V8s, and the V8s were very dominant, but it was also during this period that there were also smaller engine subclasses of racing available for other manufacturers to be involved. Between 1980 and 1990, there was a big introduction of other non-local car brands, which were also smaller non-V8 engines, and this was an extremely dominant period of time for non-V8 engines and overseas car models. During the decade, 7 championships were won by non-Australian cars, which were also mostly non-V8 engines. Between 1990 and 2000, the championship returned to being a Ford versus Holden V8 championship. By 1994, that was the last year that there was actually a non-Ford and Holden car on the grid. This also birthed a beginning of what you'd probably term as standardisation of the cars. There was early regulation and sort of guiding principles for the technology used on the cars and the engineering of the cars. Between 2000 and 2010, it was pretty much similar. Still Ford versus Holden. The other thing was that probably by the end of this decade, we were a long way down the path for technology and performance being quite close, and the cars were heavily engineered and were beginning to start to look very similar in their appearance. The 2010 to our current year sort of decade was interesting. There was a reintroduction of new car manufacturers during this period. Nissan have persisted and are still within the championship. Volvo and Mercedes had brief times with the championship but have since left the championship as a manufacturer. So we're left with Ford, Holden and Nissan on the grid in our current year of 2018. This is probably also a time period where you could class it as a little bit of sustainable action occurring in the series. The series opened up to allowing other non-V8 based models to be used, so it was the beginning of a step in the right direction. The point being, between our current year and all the way back to 1969, is that the cars have loosely followed what is being produced locally. So from a local standpoint, Ford began producing cars in Australia in 1930, Holden 1948, Chrysler 1950, Toyota 1960, Nissan 1972. In 1980, Mitsubishi bought out Chrysler, so that's when Chrysler disappeared from production in Australia. Nissan had a 20-year period in Australia and then exited in 1992. Next was Mitsubishi in 2008. They ceased production in Australia. So that left 3, which was Toyota, Holden and Ford, all which disappeared quite quickly. Ford in 2016, Toyota in 2017, which was just 3 weeks before Holden disappeared in 2017 also. So by the time 2017 had finished, there was no more local car production in Australia. So supercars, from from looking at them in our current year, they really are very similar from a technical standpoint. The outer shell of the car really is just a branding. It offers negligible sort of performance enhancement. There is, as I stated, navigation away from V8 engines, and that is very early stages. Interesting to note though, following the early series performance for this year, Holden has actually decided to cease their V6 turbo sort of project that they had running, which they had planned to implement in 2019 for their race engine, but they've said that they will cease that now and race the V8 engine again next year, considering its performance so far this year. So that somewhat rise and fell quite quickly. And also in our current year we have two international partners from a motor racing business perspective, being Penske and Andretti. Supercar engines are full combustion V8 engines. They are 5 litres, very loud, very powerful, and very thirsty engines. Since the late 2000s, V8 supercars rather, have been powered by E85 fuel. One positive is that it produces less greenhouse gas emissions. However, it almost operates exclusively in the racing space. E85 is not commonly available in the public, both in road cars and at the fuel pump. So in a nutshell, this is what happens. Fuel goes into the supercar and it creates a lot of power, and also creates a very big and powerful sound, which is a huge marketing sort of vehicle for V8 supercars to promote their brand. But with that also we get carbon emissions. So that's a oversimplification of why they use a fuel-based engine and a V8 engine. So from an internal perspective, supercars is the pinnacle of Australian motorsport and has a huge influence on other development series. What I've put there is just a fairly simple progression, which probably more or less accounts for 80% of the drivers that are currently racing in the supercar series. Most of them began in kart racing, moved to an open wheel type racing like Formula 4, and then moved to what is called Super 2, which is effectively supercars just on a more amateur level, and from there they make the transition into supercars. That isn't to say that there are other avenues for progression as a racer, but that is quite a common one. The interesting point is that as you move away from supercars, technology and engineering certainly declines, and the racing, for lack of a better word, becomes less refined or somewhat dirtier than what supercar racing is. Sponsorship is hugely important for both the series and more or less for the sponsors as well. There's 4 good examples of very long-standing sponsors of the Supercar Championship. Interestingly, 3 are pretty much direct users of the fossil fuel industry: Shell, Caltex and Fuchs. Shell and Caltex being fuel producers and Fuchs being a lubricant producer. Current success, I mentioned earlier that the Penske and Andretti involvement, that's a hugely successful sort of outcome for supercars, having those 2 international partners as part of the sport now. And just generally the history of the sport, the series has been around for a long time and has branched across many different decades and generations of people, so it has a huge influence on what's going on now. So from a societal standpoint, car racing and supercars has had in the past a huge influence on car sales. There's an adage which was coined which is win on Sunday, sell on Monday, and that was very much a true statement back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Each round is quite a large event and brings great tourism to the venues and the cities, and it certainly isn't a muck around from a business standpoint. It creates a lot of revenue and a lot of jobs. So this is an interesting graph. The sale of both Fords, Falcons and Holden Commodores fell drastically during the early new millennium. Fords more so than Holdens. What was significant about this sort of time period is it draws correlations between on-track performance and sales. So between 1996 and 2002, 6 of the 7 championships were won by Holden, and that was largely on the back of the uncompetitive AU Falcon. You can see in the graph there that the sales also reflect that. It was an unpopular model in the public as well. The release of the BA Falcon in 2002 certainly reignited on-track performance as well as Falcon sales. But however, pretty much from this point, both cars fell out of favour with the Australian public, with sales plummeting. It was quite clear that these types of cars were just not popular with the public anymore. So what's happening in the real world? Well, engines are getting smaller and more efficient. There's a huge rise in hybrid technology. Toyota probably is the market leader of this space. They were the first to bring a largely produced model, the Toyota Prius, and they've just moved forward from there with many other models now being available in a hybrid powered engine. As I said before, the large powerful sedans are no longer popular. Interesting though that there is huge advancement in the electric space with sports cars. So here are some examples: a BMW i8, a Honda NSX, a Toyota Supra and a Tesla Roadster. These are all hybrid or fully electric cars, the Tesla being the only full electric there in those 3 examples. But yeah, the point being is that electric powered motors have come a long way and are extremely powerful now, and these cars represent that performance. Similarly though, those brands that I've suggested are also creating daily drives which are of a hybrid or electric nature. The BMW 530e, the Honda City or Grace, depending where you are in the world, the Toyota Camry and the Tesla Model 3. These are all everyday models which are available in a hybrid or full electric motor system. But what about Ford or Holden, the 2 mainstays of the Supercar Championship? They have done pretty much next to nothing. Ford has published that they're hoping to have a large option of hybrids available in the next 5-year future, and Holden even less so than that. From a regulation standpoint, the Supercar series is governed by this chain of command: the FIA, which is the Federation Internationale del Automobile, which is a global body; CAMS, which is the Confederation of Australian Motorsport, and then from there into the Supercars Championship. FIA was founded in 1904. It's the governing body for world motorsport. It is non-for-profit. It centres its output on fair play and safety. However, they do have an action for the environment plan, which has 2 principles in there, being measure and improve and innovate and promote. Innovate and promote is quite an interesting one, as it draws conclusions about wanting motorsport to be a promoter of new technology so that the public space will also improve. CAMS was founded in 1953. It's the ASN for the FIA in Australia, and that was granted in 1960. They have a very thin environmental policy which just details monitoring and compliance activities. Supercars, through their own internal regulations, they indicate very ironically that car models must be road available, which they are in a name sense. However, the cars on the road bear very little resemblance to what is actually being raced. V8 turbocharged V6 or turbocharged 4-cylinder motors are allowed under their engine regulations. The last two dot points I wish were hyperbole, but they're not. These are pretty much direct quotes from the CEO of supercars, who says that the racing is to be fast, loud and high-powered, irrespective of the engine type, and that they are non-compromising on their DNA, and that links to the Holden and Ford relationship. So all of this effectively creates what I call a big separation. Supercars is maintaining a dated race series under the guise of transition. Really, not a lot has changed since the mid-1990s, amid recent global changes in the way that cars are powered, as well as there being no local manufacturing pressures. Supercars should easily be able to transition away from its V8 history toward a more sustainable and publicly aligned motor racing series. Ultimately, the series would be more relatable to the global position. Delaying such a transition could create too much space between the future global position and the race series itself, possibly leading to the supercar series being left behind and with an undesirable product and with ultimate failure. In essence, I think supercars, under its current performance, will most likely carry on in that sense and really improve little from an environmental perspective and from a sustainability perspective, and that will be in almost stark contrast to the way in which the world is going with car manufacturing. It will just leave too much of a void to catch up, and I could see it failing if that happened. Why is change needed? Well, Australian motorsport is a big business with many positive benefits. It would be great to align the series back with the public context. It would be paramountly important that there is internal sustainability and climate change response, but also that would have potential external benefit as well. I just think it's a great race series that really needs to continue, but the path it's going down, to me, would lead to failure, and a change is needed for it to be sustainable as a business itself. But it would also open up the doors to new business partnerships, which would also be very refreshing and important to the series as well. How would we change the status quo? We would need a policy intervention based on navigating away from V8 engines, introduction of electric power and mandatory hybrid power, and also with the implementation of a fully electric power option within the not too distant future. But really, who implements this policy? There's the FIA, there's CAMS, and there's supercars. Well, I believe FIA already stipulated through their own policy, so I don't think it really comes down to them. And I can't see supercars wanting to, and quite frankly I don't think they need to, in the sense that they have a very popular business model currently, but they have an overarching body, which is CAMS. I believe CAMS really should use supercars as a showpiece and lead the way forward, with the hope that they have a trickle-down benefit for development series and their own internal workings, as well as the Australian public. Hopefully, perhaps soon, we'll see something where Toyota can be involved and bring a hybrid to the series. They would be, to me, a realistic option for the near future. However, I believe the regulation needs to be there for that to happen. I can't see Toyota getting involved under the current landscape that the V8 Supercars has created. That pretty much brings it to the end. Of course, there will be 2 written essays to follow this presentation, but yeah, I hope that was enjoyable and informative. Thank you.